A morning of revelations. It was a humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson arrived in the small town of Blue Ridge, North Carolina. The sultry heat seemed to match the weight of his mission as he parked the car in front of the police station. He was not there to be recognized but to be invisible. At least for now. Richard had been a police officer for 2 decades, but today he wasn't wearing the uniform everyone expected to see. His simple plaid shirt and weather-beaten jeans were a deliberate choice. No one would recognize him like that. He wasn't the kind of person people would imagine as Blue Ridge's new police chief. What makes a man want to hide his identity when he knows power is about to be granted to him? Richard had a clear answer. He wanted to see the police station as it really was, without filters, without disguises. As a black man, he knew his arrival would be met with curious, perhaps even uncomfortable looks. But what he didn't expect, and perhaps wasn't even prepared for, was what would happen next. As he walked slowly toward the station's side entrance, taking in the everyday sounds of the place, the scattered conversations, the smell of stale coffee that hung in the air, he thought about the enormous task ahead. The station was full of murmurs about the difficult times ahead, especially after the retirement of the old police chief, Caldwell. But for Richard, the difficulties had already begun. When he entered through the side door, he passed by the police officers like a ghost. No reaction. Nobody looked twice. What he witnessed would soon prove to be much more shocking than he imagined. He needed to see the true face of the men and women who would be part of his team, without the masks of respect, without the formalities of a system that has always been more concerned with its own image than with the mistakes made within its walls. And then it happened. In the hallway, a white officer named Daniels saw him and, without hesitation, approached him with arrogant arrogance. Accompanied by some other officers, he laughed when he realized that Richard was not an acquaintance, someone from outside the police station, an unimportant man. Not unlike an unwanted presence. "Are you lost?" Daniels scoffed, with a smug smile that clearly indicated he saw Richard as someone who shouldn't be there. The laughter of other officers echoed through the corridors, and Richard, for a moment, questioned himself, should he reveal himself now or wait? But before he could make a decision, Daniels stepped forward and did the unthinkable. He spat in his face. Time seemed to stop. Hot saliva ran down Richard's cheek, while the laughter around him grew louder. Richard felt the disrespect, not just for him as an individual but for everything he stood for. It was as if that act had been an affirmation that he didn't belong there, that he wasn't worthy of being in the same room as the men and women in uniform. But Richard was undeterred. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and calmly wiped his face. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniels, still smiling, replied, "Only those who don't belong here." The room was filled with laughter, but Richard's word cut the tension, almost imperceptibly but powerfully. What would happen when a man who had been disrespected in such a visceral way turned the tables and showed the true face of power? Richard didn't respond immediately, but his look spoke more than 1,000 words. He didn't need to rush, he didn't need to shout. He knew that the true proof of leadership did not come from words, but from actions. But it was clear now that, to change the police station and correct the flaws that ran rampant in that place, he would have to expose himself more than he was used to. The revelation was about to happen, and it wouldn't just be a matter of work, it would be a matter of character. Richard knew this. He had come to make a change, and he wouldn't leave without leaving his mark. The challenge of cultural change and redefining leadership. Richard Nelson knew that what he was about to do would not be easy. What he had witnessed in the first moments he entered the police station, after the incident with Daniels, was just the tip of the iceberg. The real battle was just beginning, and it wouldn't just be fought against one police officer's isolated disrespect. What he faced was a system. A deeply rooted system whose problems went beyond a single official. The institutional culture of a police force is not built overnight. It is formed slowly through gestures, unspoken words, and attitudes that are perpetuated over decades. In Blue Ridge, respect wasn't just a formality, it was a bargaining chip. But at that very moment, Richard wasn't interested in following the unspoken rules that seemed to govern the precinct. He was not there to please anyone, but to transform everything that was broken. The culture of silence and compliance. The first thing Richard noticed when he became police chief was the silence. Not the silence of those who disagree, but the silence of those who have become accustomed to living with their eyes closed. The police station was filled with a culture of conformity, where those who spoke or acted against the system were seen as threats or worse, traitors. But who within an organization decides that truth is a burden rather than a force for change? For Richard, the truth was the only thing he could bring to the table, and he was determined to use it. He knew there were officers who were just there to pass the time, waiting for the clock to tick down to the end of their shift. Others, like Daniels, were fueling bad behavior and prejudice. They acted as if power was something that was acquired through complicit silence and contemptuous attitudes. What Richard faced was not just a group of individuals with bad attitudes. He was challenging an entrenched mindset where impunity and racism not only existed, but were enabled by a police force that would rather ignore the problem than confront it. How to destroy a toxic culture. Destroying a toxic culture is one of the most difficult tasks a leader can face. But Richard knew that change wouldn't come overnight, and that he would have to be relentless in his approach. It was not enough to punish a police officer or give a nice speech about justice and respect. He needed to reverse an entire mentality. To do so, he would need to not only confront the officers as individuals, but challenge the structure that supported them. And this type of transformation begins within yourself, within your own leadership. Richard understood that the change would be difficult, but he was not intimidated. He wasn't interested in being popular or pleasing everyone. His mission was clear. If respect and responsibility were not the pillars that supported that police station, he would make them so. To do this, he started with the basics, with what he believed to be the heart of true change: building trust. And trust cannot be built with empty words, but with consistent actions and the ability to show that leadership is committed to what it preaches. He started by being an example. Richard knew that the officers there did not see him as a legitimate authority. To them, he was just a black man who was trying to give orders in a system that didn't accept being challenged. So instead of demanding respect, he showed what it meant to act with integrity. Not just when it was convenient or easy, but when it was difficult. He spent extra hours at the police station, dealing with issues that his predecessors had neglected. He approached the officers not with the coldness of a superior, but with the empathy of a leader who truly cared. No matter who was in the room, he treated everyone with respect, but also with a firmness that made it clear he would not tolerate disrespect. Redefining the role of the leader. Being a leader, for Richard, never meant being infallible or perfect. But it meant being responsible and committed to the greater good, and he knew that the greatest good for Blue Ridge was a police force that truly served the community. He didn't want to just be the boss who gave orders and punished when necessary. He wanted to be the boss who challenged others to be better, who inspired them to find something within themselves that they may not have known they had: the desire to serve with honor and dignity. Richard couldn't change every officer's behavior at once, but he knew he could start with those who were willing to listen. He needed to give good officers something to believe in, something to fight for. He needed to restore morale so that the police station was not just a place to work, but a team united by a commitment to justice and respect. He started his movement with small victories. He called for meetings with officials, informal talks, and feedback sessions. Richard listened not just to what they said but also to what they didn't say. He watched them. He understood what motivated them and what scared them. He knew that many of the officers were accustomed to impunity and a lack of consequences, but he challenged them to see themselves in a new way, not as executors of orders but as protectors of the community. For Richard, leadership wasn't just about getting everyone to follow the rules. It was about helping them understand why these rules existed in the first place. And for them to exist, they needed to be followed with purpose, not out of fear of punishment, but out of the awareness that it was the right thing to do. Resistance to change. But resistance was inevitable. And it wasn't just a few officers like Daniels. It was a resistance rooted in the very structure of the department. Many saw Richard as a threat not just because of his race, but because of his courage in challenging a culture that had been shaped for generations. They were used to a system where mistakes went unnoticed and failures were ignored. Richard's arrival was not a simple change of leadership. It was a direct challenge to those who thrived within the system. Daniels, in particular, represented the fiercest resistance. He was a reflection of what Richard was fighting to eliminate: the contempt for authority, the lack of respect for police ethics, and the treatment of his colleagues as inferiors. Daniels wasn't just an obstacle. He was a symbol of what was wrong within the police station. And yet, even in the face of this resistance, Richard knew he couldn't give up. The transformation would take time, and he would need to be prepared to face difficult days, when the pressure on him would be great and the criticism over his choices would be intense. But at the same time, he was determined to break down the barriers that kept corruption and intolerance alive within the police force. He didn't want to be remembered as the chief who made Blue Ridge Police conform. He wanted to be remembered as the chief who made the police serve with true responsibility and respect. The importance of responsibility and accountability. Richard Nelson knew that the biggest challenge he would face as the new police chief would not be changing the attitudes of his officers, nor even reforming outdated practices. The biggest challenge, he knew, would be ensuring that accountability was integrated into every aspect of the police operation. When it comes to authorities operating under a cloak of public trust, accountability is not just a formality, it is the foundation upon which the integrity of the entire institution is built. And as much as the Blue Ridge Police Department had its flaws, accountability for its actions could never be a negotiable concept. What Richard noticed, however, was that within the structure of the police, responsibility was often avoided, often disguised in complicit silences and in a culture where turning a blind eye became the norm. He wasn't just dealing with the errant behavior of one or two police officers. He was challenging a system that for too long had allowed individual failings to camouflage themselves under the word internal discipline, a vague term that often meant little or no action. For Richard, this form of responsibility was unsustainable. He knew that for change to be profound and lasting, accountability must be a cornerstone of the new culture he wanted to build. However, the truth is that responsibility would not be easy to impose. With so many years of complacency, many of the officers were accustomed to operating with little supervision and without the real threat of significant consequences. For Richard, ensuring that all officers, without exception, were held accountable for their actions would be one of the most effective ways of demonstrating that his leadership was not just a formality, but a genuine commitment to change. Responsibility without excuses. The situation with Officer Daniels was Richard's first real opportunity to show what responsibility meant to him. When the contempt and physical assault, spitting, incident occurred, many officers viewed it as a simple event, something that could be ignored or treated with a mild reprimand. However, Richard knew that this was not just a personal affront. It was a question of ethics and institutional culture. Daniels had not only disrespected a colleague, but he had also dishonored the very oath that all officers had taken. Richard refused to treat the situation leniently. He knew that a weak response would not only weaken his authority but also perpetuate a culture of impunity within the police force. He knew that once responsibility was minimized, every other aspect of his leadership would be compromised. It didn't matter how popular the officer was or how long he had been a part of the department. What mattered was ethics, morality, and responsibility to the community they swore to protect. When Richard announced Daniels' immediate suspension, he was setting a clear example. There would be no room for irresponsible behavior within his precinct. The immediate response came as a shock to many of his officers, especially those who were accustomed to the tacit protection offered by the camaraderie among police officers. But this suspension wasn't just about punishment. It was a message to everyone at the station. If you violate the code of conduct, you will be held accountable. There were no exceptions. Accounting to yourself. However, the responsibility Richard was trying to cultivate was not one-dimensional. Although he was confronting and correcting the mistakes of others, he knew he also needed to be accountable to himself. Leadership is not just about correcting the mistakes of others. It requires constant reflection on one's own decisions, one's own behaviors, and one's own failures. Richard knew that to be an effective leader he would have to always be mindful of his own behavior, ensuring his actions met the standards he expected of his officers. He knew the pressure would be constant. Many, both inside and outside the police station, would be watching his decisions, waiting to see if he was as adamant as he claimed to be. The truth is that leading a police force is an extremely challenging task, especially when it comes to changes that can generate resistance and discomfort. But Richard committed himself to being the kind of leader who demanded of himself what he demanded of others: responsibility in all his actions. He didn't want to be just another boss who went through superficial changes or mere gestures of authority. Richard wanted to be the boss who demonstrated with every action his willingness to put ethics, respect, and responsibility first. This was the only way to truly transform the culture within the department and ensure that all officers, regardless of their position or length of service, were accountable for their choices. Responsibility is not limited to the department. Blue Ridge's transformation also required Richard to consider the importance of responsibility beyond the walls of the police station. He knew that the police did not exist in a vacuum. The community's trust in the police force was directly linked to the way officers behaved, not only within the police station but on the streets, in their interactions with citizens. During one of his first visits to a local school, a boy approached Richard and asked a simple but powerful question: "Are you really the boss?" Richard smiled and confirmed. The boy then asked, with a tone of discomfort, "My father says the police don't care about us." This seemingly trivial moment was a painful reminder to Richard that the police's responsibility is not limited to their own strength. It extends to the community to whom they owe loyalty, respect, and protection. Richard knew that to restore community trust, Blue Ridge Police would have to be exemplary in their actions and attitudes. This meant being responsible not only within the department, but in its relationships with the citizens it served. The police could no longer be seen as a distant or disinterested entity. For the transformation to be complete, the police force would need to demonstrate, through each action, that its main mission was to guarantee the safety and well-being of everyone without exceptions. The constant struggle for responsibility. Even with all the challenges he faced, Richard knew that the fight for responsibility would be a constant journey. It wouldn't be something resolved with a simple adjustment or a series of meetings. The real change would come over time, with a series of actions and decisions that reinforced the police station's commitment to ethics and responsibility. But as Richard knew only too well, results would take time to appear. Many of the officers were accustomed to operating under a do the bare minimum mentality, where consequences for inappropriate actions were non-existent or ineffective. However, Richard was not willing to allow this mentality to continue. He was determined to make accountability a permanent culture, an everyday practice that was maintained by every police officer and that was recognized by the community. By the end of the first year of his leadership, Richard had already seen positive signs of change. Although not all officers accepted his vision, a solid foundation was being formed. Many of the younger recruits were embracing the values of responsibility and ethics he was enforcing, and slowly the culture within the station was transforming. Richard Nelson's journey in Blue Ridge wasn't just about transforming a police station. It was about challenging a system and at the same time, regaining the trust of a community that had long felt helpless. In a place where complacency reigned, where mistakes were minimized and accountability was an exception, he entered with a clear commitment. Real change begins when impunity ends. In a world where authority is often seen as an impenetrable shield, Richard showed that being a leader isn't just about giving orders, it's about being the change you hope for. His fight for responsibility was not limited to the doors of the police station, but echoed in real life, on the streets where the community needs to know that they are protected in a fair and honest way. What Richard teaches us is simple but powerful. True leadership is built on consistent action, and accountability is the foundation on which all trust must be built. By demanding accountability from his officers and himself, he not only changed how police officers acted, but how they viewed their role. And, perhaps most importantly, he showed that there is no room for negligence when the future of a community is at stake. Now the question remains, how many other departments, communities and leaders are willing to do what Richard did? How many are willing to face discomfort, challenge established culture and embrace responsibility as a non-negotiable value? What will happen when everyone decides that true change is only possible when mistakes are recognized and corrected? Richard Nelson didn't have all the answers, but he knew that to be truly effective, he needed to start with a simple commitment. Do what's right, not what's easy.